Probably the least known and most underappreciated of the four confrontations, and, in my opinion, the actual start of the American Revolutionary War, is what has become to be known as the Worcester Revolt. Worcester would be the first community in the 13 American colonies to rid themselves completely of British rule. And they did this approximately 7 months before the battles of Lexington and Concord. By this time in 1774, central Massachusetts was an area of many small individual family farms, with very few towns. But Worcester was located smack dab in the middle of the county. And not surprisingly, the county was named Worcester County. And many of the major roads leading west out of Boston went through Worcester. And so, the British designated it the county seat, where British Crown authorities, county sheriff office, and most importantly, British Crown courts were located. These countryside courts symbolized British authority to the rural colonists and held much more importance in their daily life than any other British governmental institution. That's because most of the other British governmental offices were located in faraway Boston, and they rarely had any direct involvement with them. It's the classic out of sight, out of mind philosophy. So, to many of the middle-class farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen in Worcester, the Crown Courts were the British authority. The British Army was rarely seen this far west in Boston. These small property owners in Worcester were always anxious to protect their farms, stock, and personal possessions from the ever-present debtor claims court. Remember, after the Coercive Acts had been enacted, all local colonial courts were disbanded, and the Crown Courts had been established under the authority of General Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts. By early fall of 1774, Worcester farmers had had enough of the Crown Court officials, and they demanded that the courts be run as they had been before, by local colonial judges voted in by the people. Something had to be done. After the news got out about what had happened in Cambridge a few days earlier, many in Worcester knew what they had to do, and they came up with a very risky plan. During late August of 1774, General Gage began to get reports of rebellious activity in Worcester, where local farmers were demanding the closure of the Crown Courts. Gage was just as determined to keep the Worcester courts open. In an August 27th letter sent to his superior in London, Lord Dartmouth, Gage wrote, "I apprehend that I shall soon be obliged to march a body of troops into that township, and perhaps into others, as occasions warrants, to preserve the peace." But by September 2nd, 1774, and immediately following the riots after the Charlestown powder alarm, General Gage began to rethink the wisdom of his vow to march on Worcester. He confided his concerns in another letter sent that day, stating that it had been his intentions all along to send troops to Worcester to protect the courts, but had been informed, quote, from undoubted authorities that the flames of sedition had spread universally throughout the countryside. It began in the wee hours of the morning of September 6, 1774, only 4 days after the events of the Charlestown powder alarm, and 7 months before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. On that day, in a highly planned and coordinated Patriot Operation, an advance party of militiamen marched down Main Street in Worcester and seized the Worcester courthouse, barricading themselves inside and occupying the building. They were determined to shut down the courthouse before the new Crown-controlled courts could open for a new session. There, they sat waiting for the arrival of 25 new Crown appointees. They were soon followed by a well-organized and highly disciplined force of nearly 5,000 militiamen that assembled on the northern edge of Main Street.
Interestingly, a majority of the militia members had voted a day earlier to leave their muskets outside of town, so as not to provoke any kind of unexpected violent incident. A prudent action, since most of the militia had gathered that morning here, near this spot, just over my left shoulder, at the then well-known and popular hangout and gathering place known as Stephen Salisbury General Store and sometimes Tavern. And it was probably a good bet that many of the men were already feeling no pain after having partaken in the consumption of some liquid courage, even at this early morning hour. The combinations of muskets and liquor may have led to some unintended consequences, so the decision to leave their firearms at home was probably a very good idea.
On the appropriate drumbeat, the militia formed up in front of the Worcester courthouse, assembling themselves into 37 town military companies, and then were instructed to line both sides of Main Street, forming a kind of gauntlet. And then they waited for the King's men to arrive. When the 25 Crown court officials did arrive to the courthouse, they were denied entry by the militiamen, and then, one by one, they were escorted down the street to the nearby Daniel Haywood Tavern and placed under guard. Faced by approximately 5,000 hostile militiamen, the Crown Court officers quickly figured that the better part of valor here was to endure the humiliation and save their lives. They had all heard stories of Patriot gangs tarring and feathering Loyalists and British Crown officials who they deemed traitors to their cause. And they knew that today was not going to go well, so they happily cooperated with the Patriot militia and anxiously waited to see what would come next. General Gage and his troops were nowhere to be found in Worcester that day. And in order to save their lives or risk certain injury, the Crown officers reluctantly signed documents disavowing their appointments by King George III. And then, with their hats in hand and their heads bowed, they were forced to march publicly through the gauntlet, enduring verbal insults, some physical blows, and some egg throwing, in a procession back towards the courthouse, renouncing out loud their oaths of office and continually repeating it over and over again through the entire gauntlet, so that all militiamen could hear their renouncements. This is what Main Street looks like today, and this is the route they were forced to take, from the approximate location of Haywood Tavern towards the courthouse. The Crown officials were forced to continue to renounce the king until the gauntlet ended at the northern town limit, and then the militia leaders ordered the British out of their town and told them to continue along the road towards Boston. With this bold action, the people of Worcester were back to governing themselves. This is what the road looks like today, towards Boston along Route 9. It's a busy intersection known as Lincoln Square.
And as incredible as it seems, this was the first real action of the Revolutionary War where British authority was forcibly removed from a patriot town, and which the British never returned.
The spectacle of the Worcester Rebellion against British authority and the public humiliation of its officials sent a shockwave across the Massachusetts colony, all the way to Philadelphia, where the First Continental Congress was in session. These colonial militia forces had exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the Patriot resistance movement. During this incident, not a shot had been fired, bloodshed had been avoided, and most importantly, British authority had been decisively overthrown for the first time in the American colonies.
Considering these memorable events of September 6, 1774, it remains a mystery why the city of Worcester has yet to honor or commemorate such an extraordinary day. While Worcester does little, the towns of Lexington and Concord and their surrounding community proudly celebrate each year their contributions to the historic battles fought on April 19, 1775.
It was time for the New England colonists to seriously organize, militarily. On September 21, 1774, only 2 weeks after the Worcester Revolt, the former Massachusetts legislature met in convention in Worcester, and in direct defiance to General Gage and the British Crown, declared itself the first provincial Congress, free and independent of British rule. From here on out, they declared, they would exercise complete local governmental control in the rebellious portions of the Massachusetts Bay province. A major act of rebellion.
Among other things, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress urged local town leaders to organize a third of the militias into special companies of Minutemen, ready to march on a minute's notice, and to be in constant military readiness. As a former U.S. Army officer, to me, this moment was the unofficial origin of the United States Army.
Today, Worcester is the second largest city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, second only in size and importance to Boston. So let's take a look at the motorcycle route that will take you into Worcester. Again, using Boston's Faneuil Hall as a starting point, work your way out of Boston and take one of the many state highways into Worcester. I personally like Route 20, better known as the Boston Post Road. Although it can be busy with traffic during peak commuting times, at other times it is a pleasant motorcycle ride through eastern and central Massachusetts, and I recommend it. As you can see from the map, you will need to work your way over to Route 9, which eventually runs into Worcester. Again, Route 9 is a busy state highway, especially as you get close to Worcester, but it's the best way to get into the center of Worcester while staying off the interstate highways. As you approach Worcester Center, work your way over to Grove Street near Lincoln Square, and then ride south along Main Street, passing the old Worcester Courthouse on your right. Continue down about a mile to the Worcester City Hall Plaza. Take a left and circle around the plaza until you come back out on Main Street. Take a right onto Main Street and follow it north. About a couple hundred yards down Main Street, you will see the new current Worcester Courthouse on your right. This spot is approximately the location of the colonial-era Haywood Tavern, where the Crown officials were being held. This would have been also the starting point of the Gauntlet. Continue north on Main Street until you come out at Lincoln Square. This would have been the exit point of the Gauntlet. Route 9 towards Boston would be on your right, the direction that the Crown officials would have used to get out of Dodge and hightail it to Boston on that fateful day. As you can see from my video, a lot of construction was taking place on Main Street on that day. Hopefully, it will have been completed by the time you ride it. One last interesting tidbit before we leave Worcester. John Adams, the ardent patriot, member of Continental Congress, one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, and subsequent second President of the United States, started his professional career as a young school teacher in Worcester, and the city has erected an historical marker just outside the old Worcester Courthouse. Check it out if you get a chance. Next to Boston, Portsmouth, New Hampshire was probably the second busiest seaport in New England during this time. When you come back, see what happens at Portsmouth. See how the first armed raid against the British Army turned out when you check out Part 5 of The Powder Alarms. If you've liked watching this episode of The Powder Alarms, please hit like or subscribe so you can keep up with new episodes as they become available. And lastly, please share this channel with your friends. Thanks for watching.